AI agents are everywhere, automating tasks and making decisions at machine speed. But agents make mistakes. Just one rogue agent can do big damage before you even notice. Rubrik Agent Cloud is the only platform that helps you monitor agents, set guardrails, and rewind mistakes, so you can unleash agents, not risk. Accelerate your AI transformation at Rubrik.com. That's RUBRIK.com.
This episode of Worlds Turned Upside Down is made possible with support from a 2024 grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Rachel Revere last saw her husband Paul on the night of April 18, 1775, when he briefly came home to 19 North Square in Boston. A long night lay ahead. Paul had just returned from the Old North Church, where he had directed a fellow rebel to hang 2 lanterns in the steeple to warn colonists across the river in Charlestown that British soldiers were moving by water from Boston to the mainland and then on to Lexington and Concord. Now he was headed west to warn local communities that the regulars are coming out. Paul grabbed his boots and overcoat, said the words he needed to say to his wife, took one last look at his children, and then vanished into the night. And then Rachel was alone. Rachel and Paul had been married for less than 2 years by that April night, when the silversmith raced ahead of the redcoats sent by General Thomas Gage to find and destroy arms, ammunition, and military supplies in the town of Concord. By the morning, several of the king's subjects would be dead, many more would be wounded, and Massachusetts Bay would be in open rebellion. Tragedy had brought the Reveres together. In May 1773, Paul's first wife, Sarah Orne, passed away at the age of 37. 5 months earlier, Sarah had given birth to their 8th child, a baby girl named Izanna. As it is in our own time, childbirth in the 18th century was both a moment of great joy and a moment of great danger. Whether Sarah succumbed to an ailment related to Izanna's birth is difficult to know, but Izanna herself was sickly and would not live to see her first birthday. Paul became a grieving widower with 6 surviving children. Paul met Rachel Walker in the months after Sarah's passing. Perhaps they already knew of each other, or at least she knew of him from his engraving of the bloody massacre on King Street on that cold March night 3 years earlier, or from silver pieces in her family's home. In a town of 16,000 people, a town that was all but an island in these years, most everyone knew everyone. Second marriages were not uncommon in this world, especially when surviving spouses had large flocks of children to tend, or an advantageous match could advance one's wealth and social standing. By all accounts, though, Rachel and Paul's courtship in the summer of 1773 was an affectionate one. He charmed her with poetry, calling her the fair one nearest my heart. In October they were married. Paul made the silver rings himself. Inside Rachel's he engraved the words, "Live contented." Rachel settled into Paul's home at 19th North Square. She was now stepmother to 6 children. The oldest was a teenager, the youngest just a toddler. Paul's wish that Rachel might live contented with him in their home became a challenging one to fulfill in the months after their wedding in October 1773. The destruction of East India Company tea in Boston Harbor that December brought retribution from Parliament in the form of the coercive acts that shuttered the town's port and remade the colony's government. Colonists tarred and feathered customs officials who dared uphold the law. More redcoats arrived in town and found quarters on the commons, warehouses, and private homes. The masts of more warships appeared in the harbor. The port's closure made getting food and goods more difficult. Paul's known association with the Sons of Liberty made him a target. A Continental Congress in Philadelphia gathered to find a way out of the imperial crisis, while calling for greater resistance to Parliament. By boycotting British goods, and empowering intrusive local committees to enforce compliance. Some British Americans began calling themselves loyalists, others patriots, and yet confusingly, all professed fealty to George III as their rightful and lawful king. Provincial militia began drilling with vigor in the countryside, watching the army's movements in town. And then the regulars marched out of Boston on the night of April 18, 1775. And then Paul stopped at home before riding out to warn the regulars were coming out. And then Rachel was alone. By the afternoon of the next day, everyone in Boston, in the surrounding towns, and even in some neighboring colonies knew what had happened in Lexington and Concord. Even if Bostonians hadn't yet heard the full tale, the sight of breathless and wounded regulars told them all they needed to know. So did the scene that night. For as darkness fell, Rachel and her children, Bostonians as well as British regulars, loyalists as well as patriots, freemen as well as the enslaved, could see a ring of lights flickering in the distance, encircling the town. The campfires of 20,000 provincial soldiers, militiamen, and ordinary colonists who had raced toward Boston on the heels of the retreating regulars. War had come. The rebels had the high ground, and Boston was now a town under siege. I'm Jim Ambuske, and this is Worlds Turned Upside Down, a podcast about the history of the American Revolution. Episode 22, The Siege. On April 22nd, 1775, 3 days after the skirmishes at Lexington and Concord, General Thomas Gage dashed off a short letter to Lord Barrington, the Secretary at War in London. Gage acknowledged Barrington's own letter from 2 months earlier, one informing him that George III had named Major Generals William Howe, Henry Clinton, and John Burgoyne to commands in the colonies. The commander-in-chief for British forces in North America dispensed with the acknowledgement in just a few brief words. And then, almost as if it were an afterthought, Gage offered an equally brief reflection on recent events, one that began,
"I've now nothing to trouble your lordship with, but of an affair that happened here on the 19th instant."
Gage's terse report of 137 words to the Secretary at War betrayed little of what had really transpired on Lexington Green or in the town of Concord. Nothing of the intense clash between the king's subjects in both hamlets, nor of the running firefight between regulars and militiamen back down the road to Boston. But to Lord Dartmouth, the Secretary of State for the Colonies, Thomas Gage, as governor of Massachusetts Bay, offered a franker and fuller report, one that concluded with an ominous warning.
The whole country was assembled in arms for a surprising expedition. Several thousand are now assembled about this town, threatening an attack and getting up artillery, and we're very busy in making preparations to oppose them.
The outbreak of the war really demonstrates another crucial way we should consider our revolution, and that is it's a civil war. It's only a revolution because they win. My name is Brad Jones. I'm a professor of history at the California State University, Fresno. The reality is that in 75, a civil war is happening. British subjects are fighting British subjects, killing each other. If you're living in a place like Boston or New York, you're literally having to make the decision to possibly have to kill your neighbor, kill a cousin, people that you know, people that you've grown up with. In these moments, they're not fighting against an absent king, tyrannical king. Subjects are being asked to fight against one another.
Confronting those difficult choices also meant confronting what it meant to be British and what it meant to be loyal.
The great irony at the start of this war is that American colonists go to war against Great Britain not because they're American or they're arguing for a new definition of a people. They're saying we're actually the Protestant British subjects here. We're the ones trying to stand up for the very values and ideals that we've argued made us a people over the last half century. It's you guys that have turned into something else. That's a really powerful, intoxicating narrative that really strengthens this kind of budding patriot cause. This idea of loyalist or loyalism that emerges in the same period at the start of the war, they struggle. What's it mean to be a loyalist?
And in Boston, a town now under siege by rebelling British Americans, and in communities elsewhere in the colonies, the king's subjects faced an equally difficult and more immediate question. Now that Britons had fired on each other at Lexington and Concord, what would happen next? So, how did the king's subjects navigate life in a besieged Boston? And how did the outbreak of war transform a provincial problem into a continental crisis? To begin answering these questions, we'll first head to Boston to pass back and forth between British lines in the early days of the siege, to follow some colonists struggling to get in and others trying to get out. We'll then travel south to Philadelphia to the meeting of the Second Continental Congress to create a Continental Army and appoint a commander-in-chief, before returning to the capital of Massachusetts Bay to advance with British regulars up Breed's Hill to win a Pyrrhic victory at terrible costs. In the weeks before General Gage ordered Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, Major John Pitcairn, and their men to seize and destroy arms and ammunition in Concord, the British Army had fortified Boston Neck, the small sliver of land that connected the town to the mainland. With tensions rising and fearing a possible attack by provincial militia drilling just outside town, Gage ordered the Neck reinforced to prevent an assault and control movement in and out of Boston by land. By then, some of the town's inhabitants had already left for the mainland, but within hours of the fighting at Lexington and Concord, the British had doubled the guard and sealed off the Neck. No one without a proper pass could get in or out of Boston, trapping thousands of residents inside town. In a letter to a friend in London, Anne Holton, the sister of Customs Commissioner Henry Holton, described the tense, bewildering, and frightful hours after Lexington and Concord.
The next day, the country poured down its thousands, and at this time, from the entrance of Boston Neck at Roxbury round by Cambridge to Charlestown, is surrounded by at least 20,000 men, who are raising batteries on 3 or 4 different hills. We are now cut off from all communication with the country, and many people must soon perish with famine in this place. Some families have laid in a store of provisions against a siege.
The merchant John Rowe chronicled these precarious early moments in his diary.
All business at an end, and all communication stopped between the town and country. No fresh provisions of any kind brought to this market, so that Boston is in a most distressed condition.
Holton wasn't sure who she could trust or from where the next attack would come.
We are threatened that whilst the outlines are attacked, with a rising of the inhabitants within, and fire and sword a dreadful prospect before us. For several nights past I have expected to be roused by the firing of cannon. At present, a solemn, dead silence reigns in the streets. Numbers have packed up their effects and quitted the town, but the general has put a stop to any more removing, and here remains in town about 9,000 souls, besides the servants of the crown.
The sound of gunshots in the distance occasionally punctured that solemn dead silence. Rebel colonists encircling Boston peppered British soldiers and sailors who drew too close to the mainland. To Admiral Samuel Graves, the commander-in-chief of the Royal Navy in North America, the British Americans who had fired on the King's soldiers at Lexington and Concord had done so dishonorably in the Indian manner of fighting, concealing themselves behind hedges, trees, and skulking in the woods and houses whereby they galled the soldiers exceedingly. If Admiral Graves had had his way, his warships would have lobbed incendiary shells into Roxbury and Charlestown, where rebels were hiding and harassing his sailors, but Gage prevented him from giving that order. Instead, Graves deployed boats to ring the town and stop civilians from leaving. He believed that if women and children remained inside Boston, the king's rebel subjects would be less likely to attack. With her husband Paul just across the river in Cambridge, Rachel Revere, her stepchildren, and her own 5-month-old son were trapped in town, with provisions running low, with almost no news coming in or going out. In the days immediately after the skirmishes, she tried to get a letter to Paul, begging her husband that,
You will take the best care of yourself and not attempt coming into this town again. And if I have an opportunity of coming or sending out anything or any of the children, I shall do it.
Rachel enclosed 125 pounds in cash with her letter. She entrusted both to Dr. Benjamin Church, a friend, a member of the colony's provincial congress, and unbeknownst to the Reveres, one of General Gage's informants. The letter never made it to Paul. Dr. Church turned it over to Gage, and the money disappeared into someone else's pocket. While Rachel soothed her children and prepared for the worst, both Gage and the town's leaders recognized that despite the recent horrible events, they need not lead to a full-scale war. Gage saw no immediate need to declare martial law, nor did he want to escalate matters by sending more soldiers out on expeditions, hoping that some conciliatory measures might lead to better things. On April 21st, 3 days after the battles, John Rowe recorded in his diary,
"This afternoon, several gentlemen met with the selectmen to consult on our situation and choose a committee to draft a memorial to General Gage."
The committee asked that civilian inhabitants, most especially women and children, be allowed to leave town with their personal effects. Gage agreed, but on 2 conditions. The first, that male residents who remained inside Boston swear not to take up arms against the king's soldiers should the rebels attack the town. The second, that inhabitants leaving town surrender their arms and ammunition to the army. Across the river in Cambridge, the Provincial Congress learned of the proposed deal and urged Boston's selectmen to accept it. As in other colonies, an extra-legal Provincial Congress had all but seized the reins of government in Massachusetts Bay as British authority began collapsing in the colony months earlier. Now, it advised Boston's selectmen that Gage's proposal was just and reasonable, and as the inhabitants are in danger of suffering from the want of provisions, which in this time of general confusion cannot be conveyed into the town, we are willing you should enter into and faithfully keep the engagement. But one did not simply walk out of Boston. Fleeing residents required passes issued by the army to exit the town, and they weren't always easy to come by. Bostonians could bring only their personal effects with them, no merchandise from their stores or tools of their trade, and they could not return to their homes once they left. British officials permitted just 30 wagon drivers to enter the city each day, meaning that most evacuees could take only what they could carry with them. In late April, Rachel Revere managed to get a letter to her husband Paul in Cambridge, telling him that she was making arrangements to leave town. While her own letter is now lost, Paul's reply helps us to understand the difficult choices families faced as they confronted evacuation. As he wrote to Rachel,
"I am glad you have got yourself ready. If you find that you cannot easily get a pass for the boat, I would have you get a pass for yourself and children and effects. Send the most valuable first. I mean that you should send beds enough for yourself and children, my chest, your trunk, with books, clothes, etc. to the ferry. Tell the ferrymen they are mine. I will provide a house here where to put them, and will be here to receive them."
Paul's mother and 2 of his sisters seemed intent on staying in town for now, and if so,
"I will supply them with all the cash and other things in my power, but if they think to come away, I will do all in my power to provide for them."
the hardest instruction he saved for his eldest son, 15-year-old Paul Jr.
"It is now in your power to be serviceable to me, your mother, and yourself. I beg you will keep yourself at home or where your mother sends you. Don't you come away till I send you word."
As the Reveres would not be able to return once they had left, Paul Jr. was to stay behind with the house for the time being, along with all the objects the family could not carry or were not permitted to take with them. None of his father's instructions would matter, however, if the family could not get a pass, and that was proving difficult, not just for the Reveres, but for many Bostonians. John Rowe applied for one on April 28th without success, even though friends and acquaintances had already left. To secure one for their family, Rachel and Paul resorted to bribery. By early May, Paul had applied to Captain Irvin of the 47th Regiment for a pass to bring his family over water by ferry to Charlestown without any luck. For Rachel, this was unpleasant business. As she wrote to Paul,
I cannot say I was pleased at hearing you applied to Captain Irvin for a pass, as I should rather confer 50 obligations on them than receive one from them.
But knowing that Captain Irving or one of his men would open her letter and read it before sending it on, she included with it
2 bottles beer and 1 wine for his servant.
Surely the men needed something to eat with all that delicious wine and beer. Rachel told Captain Irving that her husband had some veal and beef in Charlestown that he would be willing to send over to Boston if that would please them. To the officers, this was very acceptable, even more so as supplies of fresh beef were running low in town. A pass was soon made ready for Mrs. Revere, family, and effects. By early May, Rachel and all of her children except Paul Jr. were safely out of Boston. Departing Bostonians would eventually deposit more than 2,000 guns and nearly 1,000 bayonets at Faneuil Hall as they left town, in accordance with one of General Gage's conditions to leave. Watching the exodus, one merchant thought that nearly half of the town's inhabitants had left by early May. Not all were as fortunate as the Reveres. For those lucky enough to get passes, John Andrews told a friend in London, the parents carry bundles in one hand and a string of children in the other, wandering out of town, not knowing where they'll go. But as some Bostonians were struggling to get out of town, other colonists were trying to get in. For colonists sympathetic to the crown or outspokenly loyal to the king, life had become more dangerous. In Falmouth, Maine, a territory that was then part of Massachusetts Bay, rebels arrested an Anglican priest named John Wiswall in early May on suspicion of undermining the resistance movement. Under interrogation, Wiswall avowed that not the severest punishment, not the fear of death, would tempt him to violate the oath of allegiance and supremacy to King George, his sovereign and head of his church. Freed on parole, the Reverend Wiswall escaped to a British warship and made his way to Boston, arriving without money and without clothing. His family were at more than 100 miles distance from him, and they were surrounded by enemies who bear the greatest malice to the Church of England. Loyalists in Boston began arguing to General Gage that allowing the town's residents to leave with their personal property was a mistake. The pernicious tendency of such an indulgence could have catastrophic results. What they asked was to stop the rebels from firing on the town once all their friends and family were out of Boston. Gage saw some sense in the argument. He already feared an attack, and with intelligence reports arriving daily that rebel colonists and extra-legal congresses in other colonies were seizing supplies and sending militia to Massachusetts Bay, Gage reduced the number of passes made available to residents on any given day. Outside of Boston, some British Americans had little sympathy for the plight of Reverend Wiswall or other loyal subjects who were taking refuge in the town. From Mercy Otis Warren's point of view, they were choosing the wrong side in the fight for British liberty.
Mercy Otis was born in 1728 in Barnstable, Massachusetts on Cape Cod. She was one of numerous children. She was the eldest daughter. Her family was of rather typical Puritan stock. Her father was a farmer and merchant. But what made her different even as a young girl is that she was able to get a very sophisticated education. I'm Rosemarie Zagarri, distinguished university professor and professor of history at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. Mercy Otis, as a young girl, had exhibited a great deal of intellectual curiosity and spunk. Her father allowed her to be tutored, educated, along with her very intelligent brother.
Warren's brother, the attorney James Otis Jr., read ancient languages and attended Harvard University, an education typical for a man of his social rank and standing, and he became a leading intellectual force in the early resistance movement against Parliament's imperial reforms. As an 18th century woman, Warren could not attend Harvard, but she was fascinated by the classical world. And
she learned to write, and she proved to be a very elegant and eloquent and learned writer. Everyone knew that her life would unfold typically as a wife and mother, and indeed it did. She married and had 5 children, 5 boys, lived in the area, and her life probably would have been a relatively typical one, except for the coming of the resistance against Great Britain beginning in the 1760s, which was especially tumultuous in Massachusetts, and then the coming of the Revolution beginning in 1775 and 1776. She came to play a role in that conflict by her writings and gained some local fame.
In the years before Lexington and Concord, the home of Warren and her husband James became a gathering place for local leaders planning Massachusetts Bay's resistance to Parliament and to former Governor Thomas Hutchinson.
This group of political leaders surrounding Mercy Otis Warren, her husband James Warren, John Adams, and really asked her to take up her pen in the service of the cause of resistance. She began to write these political satires directed at Thomas Hutchinson and his cronies, but also that picked up on this spirit that there may be a systematic attempt occurring, emanating from Great Britain, to deprive the colonies of their rights and privileges, to take away their rights to representative government, to take away their right to elect their own representatives, to make their own laws. A lot of political writings at this time were published anonymously or under a pseudonym, and that's what she did. At first, the larger public was not aware that this was from the pen of a woman, although this close circle of political leaders in Massachusetts certainly were. Her fame spread by this covert network of political leaders in Boston, in Plymouth, where she was living at that time. And so she was known for having a gift with the pen, for having a way to portray the cause of resistance in very compelling terms.
That included poetry. In early 1774, Warren celebrated Bostonians who had dumped tea in Boston Harbor by publishing an epic poem about Amphitrite, the wife of the sea god Poseidon, who resolved to set the northern world on fire by drowning the noxious tea leaves in the deep of the abyss.
If you read some of these plays or poetry, it's very flowery language. It has classical languages and allusions that are lost to us who did not study the classics. But people at the time were very moved by these. People at the time felt that they had a galvanizing effect on the population that helped raise the alarm about these increasing infringements on American rights and liberties by the British.
Warren had only just published a new play when colonists living in the British-American world she helped to create began laying siege to Boston. Entitled The Group, Warren's latest production satirized the loyalists surrounding officials like Gage as a swarm of court sycophants, hungry harpies, and unprincipled danglers collected from the neighboring villages. In Act 2, the character Brigadier General Haytall urged General Sylla to do what Gage had done on the night of April 18th, to send out a company of men to seize and destroy arms and ammunition.
"'Tis now the time to try their daring tempers. I fain would push them to the last extreme. To draw their swords against their legal king, then shorts the process to complete destruction."
But Secretary Dupe, a loyal colonist, did not share Haytall's confidence.
Be not so sanguine. The day is not our own, and much I fear it never will be won. Their discipline is equal to our own.
In June 1775, Lieutenant Richard Williams of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers disembarked in Mercy Otis Warren's imagined town of dupes, sycophants, and scoundrels in the very real town full of tense British soldiers, distressed Bostonians, frightened refugees, and dwindling supplies. Williams was 25 years old, a talented mapmaker and a brilliant watercolorist. when he stepped ashore in Boston on June 11th after a 6-week voyage. Later that day, he described the entrance to the harbor as very beautiful, with several small islands dotting the seascape. With an eye for perspective, and from the deck of his ship, he could see Castle William in the harbor, and beyond it, the town, the warships, and the different military encampments, a layered portrait of colors, shapes, and contrasts that enriched the scene. But that charming moment soon gave way to a stark reality. As he confided in his journal,
"But what a country are we come to! Discord and civil wars begun, and peace and plenty turned out of doors."
In the weeks before William's arrival, life in Boston deteriorated quickly. Henry Pelham, a surveyor and engraver, walked the streets of a town that he now barely recognized. It had been Pelham who had first sketched the scene of the bloody Boston Massacre 5 years earlier, a depiction of bloodshed that Paul Revere managed to copy and quickly improved to publish his more famous print. Pelham had described the massacre as the fruits of arbitrary power, the result of Parliament's overreach, but now he might say the same of the rebels besieging Boston. In mid-May, he found inconceivable the distress and ruin this unnatural dispute has caused to this town and its inhabitants. Almost every shop and store is shut. No business of any kind is going on. Hours after writing his reflections, part of Boston burned. On the night of May 17th, a soldier in the 65th Regiment was delivering musket cartridges to the barracks on Treat's Wharf. At about 8 p.m., a small fire broke out. Whether it was occasioned by accident or rather from great carelessness, the merchant John Rowe did not know. But the fire spread quickly and burned long into the night. Rowe rushed to remove his merchandise from his store before it burned, but fortunately for him, the fire never got it. It did consume 33 other stores, though, and destroyed the clothing of 4 companies of the 47th Regiment, as well as some weapons. The fire compounded another pressing problem for British forces and civilians inside Boston. They were running out of food and fodder for both people and animals. Though it was an imperfect siege, with the British still in command of the harbor, able to receive supplies from the Atlantic, ships could take days, sometimes weeks, sometimes months to arrive.
The British, even though they have fought previous wars in North America, in the 7 Years' War, and have projected power as far away as India and elsewhere in South Asia, really underestimate the difficulty of waging a protracted war against those 3,000 miles of open ocean in the age of sail. In the 7 Years' War, they have had a sanctuary, America, when they're fighting the French in Canada, for example. And they've had allies, Americans, in fighting the French. They don't have that, obviously, when the American Revolution begins. I'm Rick Atkinson. I'm an author and military historian. Expeditionary warfare, whether it's waged in North America in the 18th century or in Central Asia in the 21st century, is among the most difficult of martial enterprises. So the British Army, during the Revolution, unable to gather food and forage from the American countryside without being ambushed, is almost entirely reliant on provisions shipped from Britain and Ireland. But, for example, of 40 transport vessels that are dispatched across the Atlantic in the winter of 1775, 1776, only 8 of those 40 actually reach the King's forces in occupied Boston directly. The rest are blown by gales to the West Indies or blown back to Britain or intercepted by rebel marauders. Of 550 Lincolnshire sheep that actually make it to Boston on those ships, that breed was deemed the fittest to undergo the rigors of transatlantic travel, Lincolnshire sheep. Only 40 of those 550 sheep arrive alive. These kinds of difficulties plagued the British throughout the war. They're very diligent in trying to organize their logistical train, as we would call it today. Logistics is not a word known in the 18th century, but they face serious difficulty.
In May 1775, rebelling British Americans made life more difficult for the king's soldiers and loyal subjects inside Boston by targeting food supplies. Many of the picturesque islands in Boston Harbor that Lieutenant Richard Williams had spied from the deck of his ship were used to graze cattle herds and flocks of sheep and grow hay and other fodder. On May 27th, 600 militiamen waded through Belle Island Creek to Hog Island at low tide and herded more than 400 sheep, cows, and horses back across the creek to Chelsea. They shot any animal that would not leave the island. That same day, 30 men crossed to Noodle Island and torched a barn filled with hay. Watching the smoke rising from Noodle Island, Admiral Graves had had enough. He was determined to give the rebels the thrashing that General Gage seemingly would not. That afternoon, Graves sent the new schooner the Diana, commanded by his own nephew, to fire on the militiamen as they left the islands. As the ship approached a ferry landing, rebels and sailors traded shots. And then the wind died, all but trapping the ship as it tried to head back into deeper water. Longboats tried to tow the ship back to safety, but the oarsmen could not outrun the falling tide. The Diana began scraping the bottom. Rebel reinforcements fired on the ship with musket fire, and for the first time a cannon, killing some of the king's men. Lieutenant Graves and his sailors tried to save the ship, but in the dead of night they realized it was lost. They stripped the ship of its cannons and set it ablaze. At 3 a.m., the fire reached the powder magazine. The Diana exploded. The next night, John Rowe discovered that the rebels had killed 20 of his sheep and lambs in his pasture. On the following evening, the country people burned a house and several barns on Norton's Island. When Lieutenant Richard Williams arrived in Boston then, the town, the islands, and the mainland were vastly different places than they had been on the night of April 18th. On June 12th, one day after disembarking from his ship, Williams climbed to the top of Beacon Hill on the north side of town, where he had a panoramic view of Boston. He could see
all our encampments and those of the enemy. From this hill you have a view of the town and country all round it. Boston is large and well built, though not a regular laid-out town. But before the present unhappy affairs, it was lively and flourishing.
Some 15,000 people had once lived in Boston, but
now they are counted only 5,000, and now daily decreasing, by many families having leave to quit the town.
Looking northeast from Beacon Hill, Williams could see Charlestown across the Charles River.
This town also stands on a peninsula, and the rebels have possession of it, which greatly surprised me, as it lays so near us and might be so easily burnt. The trade of Boston must have been very extensive and of great consequence. The great number of storehouses and wharfs which are contiguous to them shows it plainly. If there was not other proofs, I can't help looking on it as a ruined town. And I think I see the grass growing in the street.
300 miles to the south of Beacon Hill, a Second Continental Congress was coming to terms with managing a war. The new Congress had already been scheduled to meet in Philadelphia in May 1775 to continue the First Congress's work of resisting Parliament's imperial reforms while entreating George III to intervene in the crisis. But the violence of Lexington and Concord altered history's course. Delegates from the 13 older mainland colonies convened in Philadelphia. Despite appeals by the First Continental Congress, Jamaica, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and East and West Florida did not send delegates to the Second. On June 12th, just as Lieutenant Williams was ascending Beacon Hill, the Congress appointed July 20th as a day of fasting and prayer in the colonies, calling on British Americans to beg God's forgiveness for their sins, to bring an end to our present calamities, and to bless our rightful sovereign, King George III, and to inspire him with wisdom to discern and pursue the true interest of all his subjects, that a speedy end may be put to the civil discord between Great Britain and the American colonies without farther infusion of blood. Whether God would end the war was uncertain, and the delegates had no time to wait for an answer. the Congress immediately turned to the question of raising money, just one of its many concerns in this fluid moment. The provincial force besieging Boston was another. In the days after Lexington and Concord, the Provincial Congress of Massachusetts Bay authorized the creation of a provincial army, composed of regiments raised in that colony to be joined by regiments from Connecticut and New Hampshire. In many ways, the provincial force was intended to bring order to the patchwork of militia units and ad hoc companies that had ringed Boston since April 19th, especially as that patchwork began to disintegrate in the weeks after the skirmishes. Farmers could no longer ignore their fields, not with harvest approaching, while others decamped from boredom or homesickness. But it was only a New England army. For years now, the king's ministers had believed that New Englanders, and Bostonians in particular, were the source of most of the rebellious spirit in British America. Lieutenant Richard Williams even called Boston the capital of all the American colonies. In Philadelphia, the delegates to Congress recognized that a disunited effort would come to no good ends.
There was a sense among many British that the Bostonians were rabble-rousers and they were the troublemakers, and if you could just isolate them from the rest of the colonies, then these protests would die off.
My name is Lindsay Chervinsky. I am the executive director of the George Washington Presidential Library at Mount Vernon.
To their good sense, the Continental Congress, the Second Continental Congress, understood that they needed to provide some support for the troops gathered in New England, and it needed to not be a New England force. It needed to be a national force to at least defend colonial interests and to push back on these incursions, even if they were still going to try and pursue a peaceful settlement. One of their first acts in early June was to create what they called the United Forces of North America. It was not yet regularly referred to as the Continental Army, and to then appoint a commander.
Congress voted to create the Army on June 14th, when it authorized the raising of 6 companies of riflemen in Pennsylvania and 2 each in Maryland and Virginia. Once fitted out, they were to march to Boston immediately and join the besieging forces to create a united army. 9 months earlier, the First Continental Congress had taken actions that some British Americans had decried as too much like those of a government wielding sovereign power. Now, the delegates to the Second were embracing that idea.
And this moment is such an interesting one because they hadn't yet declared that they were a nation. They hadn't yet declared that they were a sovereign power. They had no long-term government. The Second Continental Congress was essentially a temporary alignment. And yet, they were claiming the right to do what all nations claim the right to do, which was to have a monopoly on force.
Someone would have to lead this new Continental Army. In 1775, there were only a few likely candidates in the colonies with enough experience for the command and who were willing to fight their fellow subjects. Horatio Gates and Charles Lee were among the very few. Both were English-born former British officers who fought in North America and Europe during the 7 Years' War. Both men became frustrated with their inability to rise through the army ranks as quickly as they had hoped, sold their commissions, and bought plantations in Virginia. The retired Virginia militia Colonel George Washington was another. 21 years earlier, Washington's inexperience leading men in the field and his indifference to indigenous diplomacy had led to the killing of a French-Canadian officer in Jumeauville Glen near the forks of the Ohio River in the outbreak of a global war soon thereafter. In that crucible of war, Washington learned many hard lessons, not only about the costs of war and how to wage it, but also about his own sense of place in the empire. Washington coveted a commission in the regular British Army. For men of modest wealth like him, a commission was a pathway for social advancement, unlocking a world of potentially greater riches and political power in the empire. A commission could be purchased from an officer like Gates or Lee, but only at great financial cost, putting one out of Washington's reach in the late 1750s. He believed, however, that his services in the early years of the war merited a commission, which could only be conferred by the British government. unlike Gates and Lee, Washington never got one.
In 1757, he wrote a letter to Robert Dinwiddie, who was in the Virginia colonial government. He expressed this displeasure that he and his forces had been fighting with incredible valor. They had been in all of these bloody battles, and yet they were not receiving the same sort of plaudits from royal officials, from the government. They were not receiving the same sort of rewards, and they were not seeing the sort of professional advancement that they would have seen had they been official British regulars. We start to see this realization in his letters that he is, in the eyes of British officials, a second-class citizen. For someone like Washington, who was intensely aware of his personal honor, who was intensely aware of how people viewed him, the assertion that he was somehow less than, he really took personally. And he uses this phrase that I think is so important because we start to see his thinking where he is recognizing this moment. And he says, "We can't conceive that being Americans should deprive us of the benefits of British subjects, nor lessen our claim to preferment. And we are very certain that no body of regular troops ever before served 3 bloody campaigns without attracting royal notice."
Washington retired from military service the next year. If he had gained an officer's commission and worn the red coat of a British regular, the course of Washington's life would have been very different. Perhaps he would have been sent to command British regiments in the Ohio country he knew so well, or fought in Major General James Wolfe's army when it captured Quebec in September 1759. He might have sailed for Cuba to serve in the hellish and disease-ridden Caribbean campaigns in 1762, or had been killed fighting for George III in Pontiac's uprising the following year. But after resigning his militia command in 1758, Washington set about expanding the size of his Mount Vernon plantation and the number of enslaved people who worked his lands, began transitioning his plantation enterprise away from tobacco cultivation and toward grain production, in keeping with the English gentry farmers he so admired, scouted for new lands in the Ohio country, and by the late 1760s had become a prominent, if reserved, figure in Virginia politics. Washington had been one of the architects of the Fairfax Resolves in 1774, which rejected Parliament's claimed right to legislate for the colonies and called for a General Continental Congress to discuss the crisis. He had attended that first conference as a delegate from Virginia and was making ready to attend the second when the rebellion began.
This is where I really wish that Washington would write down his feelings. Washington rarely wrote down what he was feeling at a particular moment or what he was thinking at a particular moment, and that is especially true in 1775, and I hypothesize for 2 reasons. One, a lot of the people that he would be writing to, he was actually seeing regularly in person, and so they were likely having these conversations face to face, and therefore there's no written record. And 2, I think he is starting to formulate ideas about what his next step is going to be, and he does not want to leave a paper trail about that thought process. Now, we can get at a couple of thoughts. He had dinner on the night of May 2nd, 1775 with Horatio Gates. He came to Mount Vernon, he stayed the night, he dined with the Washingtons. I'm willing to bet big money they were strategizing, and they were talking about the battles of Lexington and Concord and what might come next.
When Washington arrived in Philadelphia for the Second Continental Congress, he believed that
it was very important to make clear that this was not just a Massachusetts problem, that this was a national problem.
And though it would have run afoul of his own deeply held 18th century ideas about honor and virtue to say so openly and publicly,
he was quite determined that should there be a national force raised, that he be given a position of high command. The way that he demonstrated that commitment was by showing up in military uniform, which he probably hadn't worn all that much in the last decade or so since resigning his commission as the head of the Virginia militia and taking up a position in the House of Burgesses.
Though Gates and Lee were more experienced officers, when Congress began considering who to appoint as commander-in-chief in mid-June 1775,
people like Horatio Gates or Charles Lee were immediately ruled out because of their association with the British forces. They were, of course, considered for other officer positions and, of course, received them. There were a number of generals in New England who were already on the ground with troops, but Because they were from New England, it wasn't going to have the unifying force. Artemas Ward was quite old. There was concern about whether or not he was actually going to live through the war and probably not provide the same sort of inspirational leadership. We don't actually see that many other names come up. And this is where John Adams really, in a lot of ways, was kind of the stage manager of the revolution. He orchestrates the nomination of George Washington. And because it was coming from a Bostonian, it was very difficult for anyone to argue with. And so Washington was unanimously selected.
Congress approved the appointment on June 15th. The 43-year-old Washington accepted the commission but declined a regular salary, lest anyone accuse him of self-interest or question his commitment to what he had begun to call the cause. He asked only that Congress cover his expenses. The new commander-in-chief of an armed rebellion knew all too well the price of failure. The British government had executed Scottish Highlanders after the failed Jacobite rebellion of the mid-1740s. Men under his command had died at the forks of the Ohio River 21 years earlier. He had witnessed the death of Major General Edward Braddock, his commanding officer at the Battle of the Monongahela, and he knew that prominent officers had been recalled to Britain for failing to achieve victory in the early months of the 7 Years' War. Certainly, in the quiet moments between the toasts raised in his honor in Philadelphia taverns before he set out for Boston, General George Washington contemplated the choices that had led him to this moment.
He was going up against the greatest empire in the world, and at the time, as they understood warfare, his chances for success were quite limited. He thought his chances were quite slim, and he understood that if he lost, he was going to be hung as a traitor. He was correctly fearful about the potential danger of the situation. But he also understood that being the commander of a standing army in a country that was deeply distrustful of standing armies and did not have a built-in mechanism to support that army was setting him up for potential catastrophe, because if he did have to requisition supplies, if he did have to use military authority as a police force, if he did have to corral citizens in some way, that was going to make him deeply unpopular. He also understood that there were factions within Congress, there were going to be factions within society who were out to get him, and so the politics of command were going to be nearly impossible.
Back in Boston, General Thomas Gage, the man who had fought alongside General George Washington at the Battle of the Monongahela 20 years earlier, declared martial law. To Gage, the rebel forces in the countryside, now encircling the capital of the colony he still presumed to govern, had abandoned peace and desecrated law. In his eyes, he had been patient and conciliatory, but Bostonians had been forced from their homes, had been thrown out of work, and the havoc the rebels had wrought on food and fodder supplies on the islands in the harbor, the loss of the schooner Diana, to say nothing of the rebels who had fired on the king's soldiers at Lexington and Concord, now demanded a firmer response. Gage proclaimed martial law on June 12th. He tempered that proclamation by availing himself to the last effort within the bounds of my duty to spare the effusion of blood, by offering His Majesty's most gracious pardon to all persons who shall forthwith lay down their arms and return to the duties of peaceable subjects. Gage's projection of strength, softened by mercy, was not without precedent. George II had done much the same during the Jacobite rebellion in the mid-1740s, and Governor William Tryon had offered pardons to North Carolinians who had joined the Regulator uprising in the early 1770s. But mercy had its limits. Gage exempted Samuel Adams and John Hancock from possible pardons. For Gage, the more pressing problem, however, was that he did not believe he had enough soldiers, ships, money, or supplies to break the siege and contain a wider rebellion. He warned London he would need 32,000 soldiers in North America, with 15,000 in Massachusetts Bay alone to bring the rebels to heel. Some British officers believed that Gage was acting too timidly, that one good major assault would shock the rebels into submission and return the colony to the king's peace. But Gage had an even more immediate concern than their overconfidence. Rick Atkinson explains.
There's high ground around Boston. There are a couple of places that are particular problems if you're on the low ground in Boston itself. One of them is Dorchester Heights. The other is Charlestown, which is right across the Charles River. There was a small town there, and then there are a couple of pieces of high ground. The British and the Americans recognize that controlling this high ground is important. If you place artillery on the high ground, you can range Boston and make life really miserable for those in Boston.
Gage, who had by now been joined in Boston by Major Generals William Howe, Henry Clinton, and John Burgoyne, drafted a plan to capture the two prominences on Charlestown, Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill, with the army set to move out on June 18th. Unfortunately for Gage, word of the plan leaked and quickly made its way out of town to rebel lines. On Friday night, June 16th, 3 Massachusetts regiments marched to Charlestown with orders to secure Bunker Hill.
The Americans get there first, and particularly there are orders sent out to seize the high ground on the Charlestown Peninsula to prevent the British from doing it. And so in the middle of June 1775, Americans in the middle of the night marched down the narrow isthmus that connects the Charlestown Peninsula to the mainland, and they begin digging. They're digging in the wrong place. There's 2 eminences near Charlestown. One is a Bunker Hill, which is the highest ground there. The other is Breed's Hill, which is a lower hill closer to Boston. For reasons that have never been adequately explained, those in charge choose Breed's Hill to do their digging. The British hear these odd noises in the middle of the night, noises of picks and shovels. They wake up first thing in the morning and see that, in fact, there are Americans entrenched on Breed's Hill. And it's determined that this will not stand. They can't allow this. It really does pose jeopardy to Royal Navy ships in the harbor. It jeopardizes British troops in Boston. And so the decision is made, well, we're going to take it back.
When dawn broke on the morning of June 17th, sailors and officers aboard Royal Navy warships in the harbor could see that the strange noises they had heard in the middle of the night had been rebel soldiers digging trenches and constructing fortified earthen walls on Breed's Hill. 5 of the warships in range opened fire on these hastily constructed fortifications, sending cannonballs that sang like tea kettles as they sped through the air. It was among the last things one rebel heard on Breed's Hill before a cannonball removed his head. The sound of cannon fire awoke Gage in Boston, who quickly convened a council of officers to develop a plan to drive the rebels out of Charlestown. Henry Clinton urged Gage to act decisively and proposed that William Howe cross from Boston to Charlestown to lead a frontal assault, while he led a smaller detachment of soldiers over to Charlestown Neck to flank the rebels and cut off their retreat. Gage rejected Clinton's plan as too perilous, fearing that if they divided their forces, the rebels could overwhelm them both and cross over to Boston. He could not afford to risk losing the town. He ordered Howe to make a direct assault. As thousands of colonists climbed rooftops and ascended hills to watch the unfolding battle, to watch the spectacle and the horror, General Howe, 10 companies of soldiers and other detachments began rowing across the river to Charlestown. Perhaps for just a brief moment, Howe's thoughts drifted with the current back to London, to Westminster Abbey, to the monument that the colonists of Massachusetts Bay had erected in honor of his elder brother, Lord George Howe, who had died fighting for the Empire in the 7 Years' War. Now William was going to fight them.
The battle begins in earnest midday. It's going to be fought for 4 hours. It seems like 4 years to the British who are in the middle of it.
Howe knew almost immediately upon landing in Charlestown that a difficult day lay ahead. Even though he overestimated the number of rebels opposing him, he could clearly see they had entrenched positions behind earthen walls on Breed's Hill and were using the buildings in Charlestown itself for cover. Fences and thick grass would impede their march. Howe declared to his men that he would not order them to go a step farther than where I go myself at your head. At around 4 p.m., to the sound of drums and calls from officers to push on, the Redcoats began their ascent. Few rebels who watched the more than 2,000 British regulars approaching them, marching in a line stretched across the landscape backed by a brilliant blue sky, ever forgot what one called that awful moment. Nor did the civilians and soldiers in Boston forget the flames that soon appeared in the sky. On Howe's order, Admiral Graves commanded his ships to send incendiary shells called carcasses into Charlestown. Watching from the governor's residence in Boston, John Burgoyne described the church steeples, being made of timber, were great pyramids of fire above the rest. While Charlestown burned, the rebels subjected Howe's soldiers to a hellish fire.
Initially, the Americans have some artillery there, but mostly it's guys with muskets in very crude entrenchments, and yet they've got the high ground. They're angry. They're fighting for their homes and for their homeland.
Rebel officers like Colonel Prescott ordered their men to aim low for the Redcoats' waists and hips, felling many regulars as they struggled over fences and through grass toward rebel positions. Some Redcoats even used their own dead to build walls made of flesh to give them cover. Major John Pitcairn was among the dead. Pitcairn had led the vanguard of British regulars to Lexington and Concord on the night of April 18th. Peter Salem, a formerly enslaved black soldier from nearby Framingham, had fought in those skirmishes as well. As Howe's regulars ascended Breed's Hill, Salem shot Pitcairn in the face. Howe regrouped his men and pushed forward once more, only to encounter another hail of gunfire, but the rebels were running out of ammunition. By 5 p.m., the Redcoats had begun a third assault, this time gaining ground as rebel fire waned. To conserve ammunition, rebel officers ordered their men to wait until the enemy was closer. As the Redcoats closed on the rebels, Dr. Joseph Warren was killed. Warren had only just been made a general by the colony's provincial congress when he made his way to Breed's Hill. He never left it. Despite his rank, Warren was fighting alongside provincial soldiers when a bullet pierced his left eye and blew out the back of his head. When the Redcoats reached the rebel lines and fortifications, the fighting turned into a melee of bayonets and the butt of guns as the king's subjects fought hand to hand with each other. The rebels began to run. Provincial soldiers on nearby Bunker Hill gave the retreating men some covering fire, but they still faced the Royal Navy's bombardment of Charleston Neck, a bottleneck that claimed many more lives. General Clinton, who had crossed over the river and taken command of some men, began pursuing the rebels before Howe called him back, knowing that New Hampshire and Connecticut regiments waited on the other side. The day had been hard enough already, and snipers were picking off the pursuers. By dusk, it was all over. The British had recaptured Breed's Hill and driven the rebels from the high ground, but
it's at a terrible cost to the British. 1,000 British casualties, 256 British dead. Of all the British officers killed in 8 years of war, 1 out of every 8 dies in 4 hours at Bunker Hill. It's a terrible day for Britain. It's not a good day for the Americans either. They've also had substantial casualties. They have lost Charlestown. It's deliberately set afire by the British. They fire artillery shells, carcasses they're called. And before the end of the day, Charlestown is in ashes. It had been a thriving community. So it's a bad day for everybody, but it's particularly a bad day for the British because they recognize now that this is really going to be hard. This is going to be bloody. This is going to be much more difficult than anybody had anticipated when the war began.
In May 1775, Guy Johnson fled his home along the Mohawk River in northern New York and headed for Montreal. Johnson was the nephew of Sir William Johnson, the late Superintendent of Indian Affairs in the Northern District, who had worked for years to keep the Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations Iroquois, allied with the king. Guy Johnson had taken his uncle's place as the king's chief diplomat to indigenous nations in this part of North America, and he had only recently learned that a party of New Englanders was coming to arrest him. In Montreal, Johnson found Sir Guy Carleton, the governor of Quebec, a colony that had so far refused entreaties from the Continental Congress, then meeting in the rebelling province of Pennsylvania to join with the other colonies in a glorious cause. Johnson warned Carleton that he had received accounts that New Englanders would move against Fort Ticonderoga on Lake Champlain, and that they considered Canada as an essential object. Carleton had already sent most of the British regulars under his command south to Boston to reinforce General Gage in 1774, leaving him with only Canadian militia to bolster what remained of his regular forces. Much would depend on keeping the Six Nations allied with the Crown in the emerging British Civil War, though Carleton was at first reluctant to send the warriors south. Carleton would not have to worry about the rebels where they were. They were coming to him. 10 days after the British won a desperate and costly battle on Breed's Hill in Massachusetts Bay, the Continental Congress in Philadelphia voted to liberate Canada. Thanks for listening to Worlds Turned Upside Down. Worlds is a production of R2 Studios, part of the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media at George Mason University. I'm your host, Jim Ambuske. This episode of Worlds is made possible with support from a 2024 grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Head to r2studios.org to find a complete transcript of today's episode and suggestions for further reading. This episode of Worlds is researched and written by me and co-researched and co-written by Annabelle Spencer. Jeanette Patrick provided additional research, writing, and script editing. Jeanette Patrick and I are the executive producers. Grace Mallon is our British correspondent. Our lead audio editor for this episode is Kurt Dahl of CD Squared. Annabelle Spencer is our graduate assistant. Our thanks to Rick Atkinson, Lindsay Chervinsky, Brad Jones, and Rosemarie Zagarri for sharing their expertise with us in this episode. Thanks also to our voice actors, Adam Smith, Grace Mallon, John Turner, Annabelle Spencer, John Terry, Spencer McBride, and Peter Walker. Subscribe to Worlds on your favorite podcast app. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.